Hello and welcome back to a new conversation in the Centre for Cyber Economics podcast series. I'm your host, Rebecca McLaughlin-Easton. In each episode, I'm joined by an international expert to unpack the economic impact of cyber risk, the opportunities it presents, and what this means for business leaders, policymakers, and investors. Today, we explore how cybersecurity is rapidly becoming a core pillar of economic statecraft, shaping trade, investment, financial stability, and global competitiveness. My special guest this time is Heidi Crebo-Rediker, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. With experience spanning the U.S. State Department, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and 2 decades of international finance, Heidi brings deep expertise in sovereign risk, global financial policy, and the intersection of geopolitics and markets. Heidi, it's great to speak with you. Thank you for joining me from Washington, D.C. today.
Thank you very, very much for having me.
Heidi, you helped shape the concept of economic statecraft. Tell me, how would you define it in today's world, and how is cybersecurity reshaping the way that countries compete and protect their economic interests?
Economic statecraft has certainly evolved over the past 2 decades, but I think the way that I would see it today is it is the deliberate use of trade and finance and investment and industrial policy instruments to influence the behavior of other states and shape global markets, and to advance national power. And I think over time it's evolved from using sort of a balance of carrots and sticks to really more sticks right now. And those core tools that we think about with economic statecraft tend to be the sanctions and financial restrictions, access to markets, payment systems, using export controls and market access, and increasingly, investment policy. So inbound investment screening, outbound restrictions, and then I think as a response to other states using and engaging more in economic statecraft as a weaponization of vulnerabilities, far more industrial policies and subsidies to build domestic resilience in strategic sectors. So I think it's hard to define one element that is economic statecraft, but I would say in the world we live in today, that it is how we compete with power, for power without direct military conflict.
Is it fair to say that cyber capabilities now sit alongside sanctions, trade policy, and financial levers as part of a state's core toolkit?
So if we think about economic statecraft and security on one end of the spectrum, statecraft is short of war to achieve national objectives. I would say cyber sits somewhere in between that space between economic statecraft and economic warfare and outright warfare, because cyber as a state and a military weapon is something that major countries with deep defense interests are very much guarding against and developing both offensive and defensive weapons of direct and indirect attack. But I think what I focus much more on is how increasingly in an increasingly connected world where everyone's looking to be more deeply connected for efficiency, where those connections become vulnerabilities. And they manifest most distinctly in the critical infrastructure that many countries have, the actual physical infrastructure, ports, utilities and power grids, wastewater, water, and satellite, as well as general communications infrastructure, as well as financial infrastructure. And because those all fit differently on what is publicly owned, what is privately owned, and how each is considered a public good, and very central to the operation of economies, they are connected and open for all the right reasons. They're very positive reasons. Connectivity has enabled great transformations of industries. At the same time, they've widened the vulnerabilities really across that spectrum that I just mentioned.
Heidi, we've seen cyber incidents disrupting ports, pipelines, and financial systems. How should governments therefore be thinking about integrating cybersecurity into trade policy, investment screening, and critical infrastructure protection without slowing economic growth at this time?
There are trade-offs between efficiency and resilience, and that is an ongoing conversation in many dimensions. I think on the international multilateral stage, we have engagement, particularly for financial services and financial stability around the Bank of International Settlements. IMF looks very closely at the macro risk of financial stability due to the increased risk of cyber attacks on financial systems. We have there's just incredible global connectivity between financial services. So there's been a great deal of investment over many years in cyber resilience for financial services. You have the G7 communicating about different perspectives, consultations, investment, information sharing, resilience strategies. And then you have institutions like the World Bank that also look at lower income countries and some unique vulnerabilities that countries who don't necessarily have the financial capacity or the knowledge capacity to actually make the investments that they need to protect their own critical infrastructure. So they are even more exposed in a way than many developed countries. In many cases, the less connected is actually safer these days.
A sign of the times, investors are increasingly assessing geopolitical, regulatory, and security risks together. Where does cybersecurity now sit within that equation? And do you think that cyber risk is being accurately priced into global investment decisions today?
So it's certainly in the background of all of the risks that are out there for private companies. They are beholden to shareholders, and again, it's a risk reward and a efficiency and profitability versus resilience argument. But the financial system has been and will continue to be the target of many cyber attacks. The part that I think is underappreciated and really uniquely exposed is critical infrastructure that doesn't lie in a single company's servers, but actually in the complex systems that underpin modern commerce. I'll go back, to electric grids and water utilities and transportation networks and ports, because those can really create connected supply chain shocks that are totally destabilizing in the global economy and then in local economies, where if you have an attack on a grid or a rail line or a pipeline, you can have cascading effects on whatever the geography is that attack had an impact. So the companies, the economies, the labor, the force that is actually disrupted, and also how those communities have to actually rebuild after a cyber attack. It's something akin to a natural disaster. I think actually in some cases a natural disaster and a financial crisis colliding. The spillovers are really proportional to the reach of the attack, but we've already seen very sophisticated malicious actors, from state-based actors that are looking at the rising geopolitical context and conflict context to place malicious software in where I would see weakest link failures. And I think we need a paradigm shift to really recognize that the cyber threats to critical infrastructure can create these macroeconomic shocks, and it's not just isolated corporate challenges. So as a result, the governments, in the United States, as federal, state, and local, and public-private cooperation across borders is really needed to have a holistic resilience strategy for I think the uptick in cyber attacks that we're likely to see, particularly on the back of, as I mentioned, geopolitical tensions rising, but also the recent Anthropic Mythos announcement, where it added a whole layer of complexity on what kind of access AI will give to individual actors, malicious actors, to extract ransom, steal IP, and really be disruptive. So, very, very powerful tool sitting not just within the state-backed cyber space, but also uh, really potentially very widely accessible.
Heidi, when it comes to financing critical infrastructure and cyber economy projects, how do you believe investors and multilateral institutions should be assessing cyber risk?
I think it's increasingly imperative. And that is because if you are financing a project and you want to have a water system that is sophisticated and digital, and that actually there are many benefits to that, and have particularly with the rise of data centers and the huge demands on energy, we're going to have to come up with a lot of creative ways to enable connectivity within grids and power sharing, and that again is very positive. And then it also introduces an additional layer of cyber risk and vulnerability. So the stakes are getting higher, and so the investment in cyber defense, it has, I think, never been more important as it is today. The response actually, I think, for countries, and it's going to vary from country to country, but there's going to be a need for public investment to bolster private investment in many of the sectors where there is a public good, where the potential victim of the attack is not able to sufficiently invest in that resilience on their own.
Coming back to cooperation and collaboration, looking at key sectors like energy, semiconductors, and telecommunications, what role does international cyber cooperation play in safeguarding global economic stability?
Well, in those sectors and in other sectors, there are those companies and those sectors face the same set of threats coming from the sort of more traditional pre-AI risks. So the ability to actually share information, and that's not always so easy for a company. They have shareholders, they don't want the public to respond in not buying products anymore. That can be pretty devastating. So there has to be a willingness to cooperate, even amongst competitor companies. And I think I've seen more and more of that. But without that cooperation, given where we're going with an AI-enabled world of cybersecurity risks, the sharing of information is ever more important. We've seen the engagement by Anthropic with the US government with companies, Anthropic with companies, to say, this is coming. Here's how we need to prepare for this reality, which is really already our present. That has to happen more and more, because I think we're moving into new territory with regard to cyber risk.
Heidi, before I let you go, I have to ask, what is the one shift you would recommend governments or organizations make to stay ahead in this evolving landscape of cyber-driven economic competition?
So the sharing of information with companies and state and local governments is crucial. And also the training, how some of the most successful cyber attacks have been with really just human error in clicking on a link, hackers finding the point of least resistance, having good policies within companies, having good training, so that you have personnel who are fully with all their antenna up, how they can actually look at a potential email and say that is suspicious, and have cyber capacity within companies that are really working together alongside the rest of the company, not sitting in some office on the side as an additionality not to be paid attention to, but really central to the whole operation of a business. And I think even more so with state and local governments or lower income countries, where they really don't have the capacity, they really have to have some additional support from outside, and that's likely going to have to come from some kind of an industrial policy shift that supports the investment.
Heidi, we have to leave things there, but thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for inviting me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Heidi Crebo-Rediker in this episode of the CCE podcast, produced by the Center for Cyber Economics, a global entity focused on the intersection between cybersecurity and economics. For more conversations in this series, just head to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes coming soon.